Hey guys. Um, so as you know, the university has closed for the time being, and most of the teaching has moved online. I wanted to prepare something for the session on entitled "Taking the Shape of the Gods," which is a session that is essentially about spirit possession and practices that involve spirit possession. Um, the main reason I decided to do a video for this is that I prepared a number of handouts, I prepared a number of videos, so it's a kind of multimedia class. And I think the materials are not easy to follow without an explanation at the same time. So I decided that it would be generally better if I recorded this. Um, so that being said, this will be essentially the substitute for my um, for my in-person class on spirit possession. Um, so essentially what we'll be talking about and what we'll be going through in the several materials that I prepared is the idea that certain individuals in certain circumstances may become an embodiment of certain gods, certain spirits, certain ancestors. This is a very widespread idea. In several religious traditions of the world, we have we know that things like this were done in ancient China, for example, in the shamanic traditions of ancient China, um, in ancient Japan as well as in classical Europe. And many other indigenous traditions. Um, and it is, and as well, you know, this practice says, it's not exactly as a practice, but this idea, fundamentally idea, has moved into the European Middle Ages as well, in the form of demonic possession, which is a very important um, part of the Catholic religion, and it's rather more sinister than other examples of this type of belief, but it also survives throughout the Middle Ages, and it has had a strong comeback, especially ever since the 19th century with spiritualism, where mediums are believed to channel dead loved ones. We have a huge sort of revival of this in the New Age movement with ideas of channeling. That can go channeling can go from general divine inspiration, but it can also go to more extreme levels like the idea of possession. Um, and we naturally also have a number of chains of tradition that have not been broken, in the sense that pagan chains of tradition were broken in the West, like for example African-derived traditions, which still make wide use of the idea of spirit possession. So we'll be looking a bit at that. But first of all, I'd like to start by showing two videos, actually. Um, so let's start with the videos. Okay, and now for the second video. And now for the third video. Okay, and this goes on like this for a while. But what I want you to do now, what I'd like you to do now is to just pause the video for some minutes and take a time to, if you want to rewatch the videos that you just watched, and to think for just for a while about what are the similar things you see across the three videos and what are the different things you see across the three videos. What do you think happens in common in three of them, and what do you think is quite different? And just make a list of that, and keep those attributes in mind, because we're going to discuss them. Okay, well, if you've taken a couple of minutes to make that list, or a bit more, well, I have no idea what you've written on that list, but from my experience in previous years, normally people say the first video seems to be quite graceful and seems to be quite planned and quite rehearsed, while the other two videos seem to be a bit more erratic in a way. In the first video, people many times describe a very strong sense of the feminine presence in the video that is actually dance. The dancer is actually a man. But whilst in the other two videos, people tend to kind of feel that you are just kind of watching something that is slightly rougher or that is slightly less kind of less developed in an artistic sense. Now, just to put into perspective those kind of ideas that generally arise when we discuss these videos. The first video is a modern rendering of a kagura dance, which is a Japanese dance, traditional dance, that whose name actually means is a portmanteau for words that would mean the seat of the gods. So it's a sort of shamanic dance that, of course, in the last few decades and centuries has been kind of evolving in a more secular way. So this is a secular instance of the kagura dance, but it uses, it uses modern music. It is a song from a video game, even if it's stylized, to sound traditional. And this sort of dance was used in Japan as a ritualistic dance by which a divine presence would manifest. In this case, we can see we can see that the dancer is dressed as a fox, and foxes are generally regarded in Shinto and also in Japanese folklore as very powerful magical beings. So this is a princess kitsune, which means fox, dance. Whilst the two other dances are still being performed in an explicitly religious context, and they're both from African Brazilian traditions. Whilst people tend to have the first impression that these dances are more chaotic, they also share a number of similarities with the first dance. Mainly the fact that there are a number of semiotic elements that allow the viewer, if the viewer knows how to do it, allow the viewer to identify the spirit being manifested. So in these two instances, we have rituals invoking spirits to manifest through the participants of the ritual. And for someone who is familiarized with these traditions, there's a number of signifiers that can be identified. For example, in the second video, you'll see that people are crossing their arms, in front of their torso. And this is a very specific semiotic. So there's a good, you can see it very well. Wait. You can see it very well here. In this participant. And this is a very strong semiotic symbol associated with an African Brazilian divinity, which is Shango, which is a god of justice and fire and mountains, but whose main attribute is carrying a double-edged axe. And so this way of having your arms in front of your torso is representative of traditional dances that would use those double-edged axes. And so anyone looking from the inside would know that this specific dance here is full of a very specific religious meaning, which is this divine presence is now manifest through these participants. The same way, if we look at the following video, you can see that there are very specific wavy movements being done by the woman who's embodying the divine presence here. And for someone who is familiarized with these traditions, this is evidently a manifestation of the goddess of the sea, Emonja, because these movements and these specific dance would be associated with this divinity. The same way in the Kagura dance, there's a number of semiotic elements that will give clues to the audience of the specific divine manifestation that is happening right there. The most obvious one in the Kagura dance is, of course, the mask, which indicates the sort of spirit that would be channeled if that was being performed as a ritual religious dance. And so these are three examples of traditional spirit embodiment manifestations. And it is quite interesting to see, and it's most interesting to see how people have essentially thought about this subject when looking at their own traditions. And one of the oldest texts we have access to in our Western tradition, to a sort of reflexive thought about this process, is Proclus's On the Signs of Divine Possession. Now, the idea of divine possession is actually much older than Proclus, so we can already, we see that very explicitly, for example, in the Pythia, in the Oracle at Delphi, where a sort of divine possession is happening. And Plutarch, before Proclus, Plutarch already discusses the processes by which divine possession happens in his text on the Oracle of the Pythia. And before that, we already have a very strong Platonic ethos towards the idea of divine channeling or divine possession, at least in Ion, where Plato discusses the fact that everything that we do that is good is somewhat or somehow channeled from a divine source. So there's already a very strong kind of construction, ideological and philosophical construction in Platonism and Neoplatonism around the idea of divine possession. But Proclus has had a treatise or a book, we are unsure, about the signs of divine possession themselves. Unfortunately, this book is now lost to us because it was censored in early Christian days. But we actually have an accusation. So the Psellos accusation that describes what the book says. So we have a Christian source that gives us information about what this book might say. And this text is very interesting. You have access to the full version of it on Blackboard. But so the first interesting thing is that Proclus says that spirits, so the spirits that have divine powers, will operate in different ways, and they will manifest in very different ways. So some of these spirits manifest in a joyous manner, others are very solemn, and others arrive through daemons, so through spirits. We've covered this before. So daemons are spirits that are below the gods, but are still above humans, but sometimes they also arrive very pure. So there can be divine possession by purer spirits as well as by lower spirits, although in this scheme, all of them would be regarded as good. And there's also this idea in Proclus, which is a very interesting idea, that some of these spirits are acting on objects or other objects, and so as such as statues, let's say, and others are working on animate beings, which can be, either animals or people. So you can have the divine possession happening both to statues or ritualistic objects or people or animals. and all of these things are often filled with divine light, says Proclus. So there's such as the statues who give oracles under inspiration of one of the gods or good daemons. So here we see that the divine, the idea here is that the divine becomes completely embodied in some sort of matter, whatever that be. And that this process is regarded generally as a positive one because it allows communication between the human and divine, such as the case of statues that were believed to give oracles. But it also but also because it allows these material things to be filled with divine light, which is in itself part of the fundamental process of apotheosis that we see in later Neoplatonism, with the idea of the soul kind of being brought back to the divine from the clutches of the material world. Yes. So then there's this idea that some people receive divine spirits spontaneously, and that they are, spontaneously seized by God at particular times or on other occasions. And then there are others who work themselves up to this state by deliberate actions. And the example given here is the prophetess at Delphi, like I was talking about before. And this is very similar to New Age practices, in particularly people who do work with channeling and have a number of rituals that try to bring these manifestation of channeling into being. Yes. So then there's this idea of a change of consciousness, which is also very important because Proclus is advancing this idea that trance is a somewhat fundamental um, a somewhat fundamental element of being possessed, and he makes a distinction between people who become completely besides themselves and unconscious, and those that, in a remarkable manner, maintain consciousness. This is very interestingly. This is also a distinction that has arisen in modern and contemporary mediumship literature, where people are generally described as either being unconscious mediums or semi-conscious mediums. And Proclus is already, in terms of our history of Western esotericism, this idea that then later manifests in spiritualist writings, in New Age writings, is already quite firmly established by the 5th century with this Neoplatonic philosopher. Yes. So yes. So then there's this idea that if the person loses total consciousness, it's essential that someone in full command of these faculties assists the possessed, which is something that sometimes we also see, especially in African-derived traditions. There still are specific ritualistic roles for people who are not embodying a divinity or a spirit. They're not being possessed, so to speak, but they're taking care of people who are possessed. And this is also something that seems to have been quite present already in Neoplatonic spirit embodiment practices. Yes. So this is then there's a bit about how some of these things, some of these manifestations can be quite violent. Yes. So this is some of these things that are quite interesting here is also this idea that the spirits will manifest in different ways according to their own nature. So there's a number we can suspect that, just as with what we just saw, that there are a number of different semiotic symbols being manifested by these dancers that believe they are channeling spirits. We can believe that something along these lines was already happening in Neoplatonic practices, since you see these divine powers right at the beginning. Some are more material and some more immaterial, some joyous and others solemn. So because most of this information would have been left out by the people making the accusation, we do not have access to it. But we can imagine by the structure of pagan texts, of these sort of pagan texts that arrived to us, for example, on the Mysteries by Iamblichus, we can imagine that there would have been a number of categories that would say, you know, spirits of Saturn arrive in a more solemn matter, while spirits of Jove arrive in a more joyous manner, and so on and so forth. So we already have this very interesting construction here, and this very interesting reflexive thinking that in many ways reflects the reflexive thinking of these traditions today. So if we look a bit at the way people who practice African-derived traditions think about this stuff, we'll see that it is quite similar. You have a handout in your blackboard as well called "Spirit Possession in African-derived Traditions," and in here I have quotes from two African-derived traditions. They're both Brazilian, so they're African-Brazilian traditions. One of them is Umbanda, which is a more recent tradition and comes from a schism in Kardashian Spiritism, and but it still involves the tradition of spirit possession, very much influenced by African beliefs in Brazil, brought in through the slave trade, of course. And then we have a bit on spirit possession in Candomblé, and Candomblé is a more traditional African-derived tradition, so it is closer in many ways to what would have been practiced by the Yoruba people in Nigeria, and like Umbanda, who already has a number of other influences like Christianity and Spiritism, and indigenous religions like Jurema, that all sort of influence the final form of the religion. However, they both make extensive use of they both make extensive use of divine possession. The first video we watched, the one with the god of justice and thunder and the axes, is a video that I believe, although it's not confirmed in the video, but I believe comes from an Umbanda ritual. The second video comes from a Candomblé ritual, which is the more sort of traditional thing. Now, these quotes here are taken from a book, which is a primary source. So this is not an academic book. It's a primary source written by Lourdes Vieira, which is called The Spiritual Guides of Umbanda and Their Consultations. So that's my translation. This book is in Portuguese. So any problem with the translation, that's my fault. But there are some very interesting ideas here that resonate in some way with Proclus's ideas, which show that in a way, people dealing with this sort of event or with this sort of practice phenomenologically tend to arrive to certain similar conclusions of the phenomenon that's going on. And that's the most interesting thing for us in the context of this class, is to try and think what sort of processes are going on with the people who believe they are channeling spirits. And it is not to arrive at a reductionist explanation. So I do not propose to offer any sort of reductionist explanation, but it's just to look at the interesting similarities between the way people understand these practices themselves and the way they report that these practices unfold. So what Vieira tells us is that each spiritual guide is connected by radiation to the gods, their fathers and mothers, and to the working field where the mysteries into which they were initiated act. In each working field, all their representatives manifest through words and gestures in similar ways. And Umbandist medium in their works receives several spirit guides, and all of them have their own manifestation, with such specific possessions that we can easily identify their chain of field of work. So the fundamental idea has to do, again, with that idea that we were discussing on Proclus, on Proclus's text, which is basically this fundamental idea that these different spiritual entities that manifest in ritual will manifest in ways that are very identifiable. And by the ways they manifest, by the ways they move, by the ways they talk, by the things they do in general, you can immediately know which category of spirit are you dealing with without needing to ask. Yes, so it's also interesting to see that there's also a kind of a position here that is postulated, which is a position of the spirit guide, which exists below the orishas, which are the gods, so to speak. If we are making a comparison between these and the Greek scheme. Both religions, both Neoplatonism and Umbanda, were monotheistic, so to speak, because both of them make reference to an ultimate divine reality that is one. However, they all postulated manifestations of this one God as many gods, in the case of Umbanda Orishas. And they also have other intermediary spirits below these gods. And in the case of the Neoplatonism, we're talking daemons and heroes. And in the case of Umbanda, we're talking the general category of spirit guides that can involve spirits of people who have passed away, but also spirits of nature and other spirits that did not necessarily ever incarnate as a human. Yes. So then she proceeds to kind of clarify what she was saying. She says, each entity in Umbanda presents intersemiotic aspects, bringing into their system of signification some keys to the mystery it represents. We call attention to three of those keys: the visual aspect, demonstrated in the realized form of the phalanx. So this is fundamentally about the dancing. This is fundamentally about the physical immediate manifestation of the spirit through the dance and through the way it moves. The auditory aspect expressed in the symbolic name and in the sung song. So the auditory aspect is manifested both in the entity's name and in the songs that are being sung to attract the entity into the ritual. And the written aspect represented in the sigils, which are sigils many entities will immediately write on the floor as soon as they become embodied. This key work, these keys work by vibrational correspondence or magnetism, by syntony and affinity with the spiritual egregore, for they are irradiating or manifesting poles of these frequencies. So now here we see, of course, this is a 2015 book. So Umbanda has naturally been very much influenced by the New Age, who uses electromagnetic metaphors essentially to make sense of spiritual realities. And more starts to use also language that is borrowed and appropriated from quantum physics and the sciences in general. But the fundamental idea here, if we take away the metaphor, which is scientific, but is still probably not meant as a literal scientific fact. If we take away the metaphor, we can see also a similar idea to Neoplatonic ideas of affinity. And sympathy, because of course, as we've talked before, one of the fundamental ideas of Neoplatonism as to the way of how the world works is precisely the affinity between different things and the sympathy between different things, because they have the same hypostasis, that is the same underlying divine principle. And of course, ultimately, everyone has the same underlying divine principle, which is the one God for the Neoplatonists. But on a different level, you have things that are associated with Aphrodite. So you could say, you know, bunnies are associated with Aphrodite because they reproduce a lot, or flowers are associated with Aphrodite because they're very pretty, or whatever. Or honey can be associated with Aphrodite because it's really sweet, while you can say, you know, swords are associated with Mars or Ares because they're used in war. So they have this whole system of associations that will also define the types of things that you bring into ritual as offerings. So you're not going to offer something that has an affinity with Aphrodite if you're worshipping another god that is not related to Aphrodite. And this fundamental aspect seems to be also seems to be an underlying understanding that we find in these texts that is fundamental to make sense of the way these spirits manifest. In a practical way, let's say that different spirits in Umbanda will drink different drinks. So if you're making a drink offering to a spirit that has now possessed one participant, you will give different drinks to these different spirits. You'll give different things to smoke. Tobacco smoke is widely used in these religions. You'll give different things to smoke. You'll give different things to eat, and so on and so forth. And all of these are based on principles of affinity and sympathy. Yes. So, and again, this is just again to sort of confirm the things that we've been discussing so far. But this idea that when embodied in their mediums, the spiritual guides make gestures, dance, swing, turn, and liberate the energy that emanates from the medium and the power of their mystery by means of the magnetic waves of the medium's spiritual body and of the temple. The dancing is the opportunity to unblock life, to shake off the dirt accumulated daily, and to accept the rhythms of life. The dances of the natural orishas, the gods, and the spiritual guides obey certain literal precepts that reveal in their gestures and their way of walking their attributes and symbolized qualities. So again, we have this idea. That these spirits are manifesting symbolic traits through literal behavior. But most interesting in this quote, and that's why I included it, and this is the new information really, is that there's this idea that the dancing itself is a religious act that cleanses you. The dancing itself, the dancing is an end in itself, which is a very important precept. It's not just because you can talk with the spirit. It's just not because others can be in the presence of the spirit, but being possessed or being an embodiment of the spirit is actually in itself a healing practice, a spiritually healing practice. And this is very interesting again, because it relates to the idea that Proclus was advancing, that people who manifest these spirits or who are possessed by these spirits are themselves filled with divine light, which from a Neoplatonic point of view is a very important thing to happen, or a very good thing to happen. So I guess that in here we do see we do get a very good idea of how these traditions, as they have been understood for a long time, these traditions, the way people understand them, does have some similarities that are quite interesting. Now, I have found, so this is one of the things about African derived traditions, which is they're not textual traditions, and they're not like Christianity, where you have, you know, thousands of years now of written theology, or even Greek traditions, which also have their fair share of written theology. Most of these traditions were oral traditions, and they keep being that way in many ways. There are some books appearing. There's, especially in Umbanda, there's a lot of work to kind of create a stable theology. But the truth is these traditions have existed in this way for a long time, and there's something very interesting in that as well. It doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't immediately follow because Christianity has a strong textual tradition that all religions should. So one interesting thing that as kind of manifested in our age is that a lot of priests, a lot of very highly initiated priests in these traditions have YouTube channels and try to transmit things as they used to transmit to people directly rather than writing them. And so I found this on a YouTube video that you have linked in the handout if you want to check, but it's in Portuguese. But so it is by a Babalorixá, which is a priest. Um, which is a priest of Candomblé, and it is from the temple Ile Yerieo Ashe Aira Intile. Sorry, I always have a problem um, pronouncing the Yoruba part. But so I've taken this out of there. I've cut it off quite a lot because it is it is spoken word, and so it can get quite rambly at times. And there's a very interesting message that becomes much clearer when you kind of just do a little cut and trim. But if any of you speaks Portuguese and you want to check the original video, it's in there. So what he says, which is also very interesting, is when you are initiated, the god, that can be Shango, or Shun, or Gun, or Shosi, it doesn't matter. He goes to the sun being initiated and he puts an ashe, he plants an ashe. Now, an um, ashe is a sort of chi or a sort of spiritual energy, mana. So it's it's in these traditions the understanding of the divine energy that pervades all of us. Because of course these traditions are vitalist, so this idea that there's a vital energy in all of us, and this is the ashe. He plants an ashe. What you manifest is that ashe inside you. That is what manifests in trance. The trance comes from this piece of God and not from the God, because it was from the God. If it was from the God, the person would know everything. He would have all the God's information. So that's not how it works. That is a fragment of God. It does not know anything. It is a brute stone waiting to be lapidated. That is why we say Father of Saint. Father of Saint means it's the name given to the priest in this tradition, because the priest takes that brute energy. It is up to him to manifest that trance. He actually creates the God within that person. In truth, this is the great dilemma of trance. It is not about deserving. It is not about waiting longer. The trance is a very intimate process. Then you ask, are they faking it? No. The person was initiated. They're dancing in the temple. They're following a ritual dance that they have learned. They are not faking it. They are God. God is in them. 1%, 2%, it doesn't matter. 1% of God is God. It's part of the faith of the ones clapping for the God to dance. When a God is there and he says hi, he wants to hug, he wants to make signs, he wants to sing, he wants to talk, that must be a very old God, because he must be in a very strong trance. It's the saint of someone who is present in Candomblé for a long time that arrives at this level of spirit possession. A cheating saint is a person who is in trance. Sometimes they are in trance, but they are at 2%, and all the show is their doing. They are not surrendering to something, they are controlling it. So, in truth, there is a sentence that one of my initiates said that is very interesting. It is a paradox. You can actually be possessed and pretending at the same time. So this is actually very interesting. I thought this was one of the most profound pieces of self-reflection on the process of spirit possession that I was able to find when I was looking for processes of self-reflection by priests themselves. I was very interested in this, and I was very interested in this because it relates very much to some ideas that are also very old and that we don't have time to cover. But for example, Plutarch in the Oracle of the Pythia, Plutarch answers a specific challenge that existed at the time against the idea that the Oracle at Delphi was a true oracle, or that oracles worked at all. And this polemic argument was, of course, that if Apollo was the god of Delphi. And if Apollo was the god of poetry and beauty, how came the priestesses at Delphi talked like simpletons? Um, because if Apollo was speaking through them, these should be the most beautiful poetry that has ever existed, but it wasn't. Um, and Plutarch already gives an answer, or Plutarch gives an answer when he's forced to kind of self-reflect on this, because he's very much pro Pythia, and he was and he worked at the Oracle of Delphi. Plutarch arrives to a very similar answer as Babalorixá Cassioli de Airá, which is essentially the idea that um, Apollo does not possess the Pythia as much as he kindles a flame in her soul. And the work of the Pythia is to kind of find that flame and manifest that flame. So here we have a completely different understanding of possession than necessarily the one we've been talking about so far. So it's not that the spirit controls you in a way, it's that the spirit puts something inside of you, and then it is your job, it is your work uh, to sort of allow that to grow and surrender yourself to that, so it becomes more powerful. And this same idea, is present both in Plutarch and in the words of this priest, which I find it's very interesting. I also find that it's very interesting, this idea of different measures of God being present within you. But of course, God, or the gods, or whatever divine presence we're talking about, one of the things that many traditions sort of agree on, especially Western traditions, is this idea that the divine, the God, is complete, completely self-contained. It is not divisible. So of course, there is more than one paradox in here. When he talks about 1% of God or 2% of God, as he then says, God is God. So that's very interesting, because there's no such thing as 1% of God, but there's also such thing as a non-complete possession, as he's saying. So there's a very interesting religious paradox here, where you can have a weaker divine possession event, as he's saying, and you can have, in his metaphor, just 1% of God inside of you. But of course, God would be, or the God would be so all-encompassing that 1% is already, like having the entirety of the God inside of you, without actually being like that. So this is the first paradox of the text, and it is not explicit. It doesn't make this paradox explicit, but it's a very interesting one. And then there's a second paradox, of course, about the idea that you can both be possessed and pretending at the same time. Um, but the idea of embodiment here, and that's one of the most interesting things that you can talk about. The most interesting thing about here with the idea of embodiment is precisely what he says. The person is not faking it, because the person is dancing, the person is praying, the person is doing what she or he learned during initiation, and therefore they're already embodying divinity. There's not necessarily an understanding that you need to be, possessed in a certain way for it to work. The process of embodiment is already underway, because this person is already behaving as embodied. So there's it is also not, and that's very interesting here, and it was perhaps not as evident in other texts, although I think it is present, in undercurrents of the text. It is very interesting that in this specific text, you have an explicit an explicit explanation that you're not a passive receptor of the spirit. You're actually building a relationship. You're actually working to manifest this presence. So it's not also about, can you be possessed or not? It is also about what can you do to cultivate these state of religious experience within you, which is a very interesting concept in these traditions, kind of texts and oral texts. And it's also quite interesting, because of course it plays into the idea that Proclus presents before, that some people do manifest this spontaneously and some people don't manifest it spontaneously, so and must cultivate the ability. So this is all kind of part of what it seems to be, you know, the phenomenology of being possessed by spirits. Now, this is a very interesting sort of piece. Um, I translated it as well from Portuguese from a news piece. And this came in the context of the election of the far-right leader, Jair Bolsonaro, in Brazil. And the fact that this has somewhat emboldened radical Christian groups to target religions like Umbanda and Candomblé. And so things have been very ugly for these traditions in the last year. Many Christian groups, especially, you know, made of you know, drug dealers and arms dealers and stuff like that, have attacked temples. There have been many terrorist attacks, Christian terrorist attacks against these temples. And this news piece has to do with actually um, a robbery, but it was an ideological robbery as well. So it was both a robbery and a robbery made by armed Christians who wanted to humiliate the people practicing their tradition. And the interesting thing that happened, this robbery happened in a temple. I believe it was a Candomblé temple, so the more sort of traditional one. Whilst people were possessed by the gods. So the ritual was happening, the possession was happening, and what the news piece says is during the robbery, the robbers told everyone to lie down, which obviously the people embodying the gods did not. After taking the cell phones of the practitioners lying down, the men started ransacking the gods and even shaking them and pointing guns at their heads in a frustrated attempt to make them lie down and wake up. After these, Oxóssi, which is the god of the hunt and the forest, cried. Who was possessed at the moment does not recall anything. The Yaos, mediums, Laís Monteiro Tamires, Vitória, and Richardson Biriba were some of them. Tamires tells that when she woke up, felt despair, but she did not know where it came from. So one of the interesting things again here in the phenomenon of spirit possession is that there seems to be actually a very strong dissociative state, whatever that is, you know, whatever explanation or whatever ideas you choose to attach to that. There's a very strong dissociative state that goes beyond the idea of just lying, because of course, you know, these people who are now embodying the gods would not bow down to robbers, and that did happen, you know, even with the threat of the gun. And of course, we're talking about a country that is much more violent than the UK, so there was a real danger of life for these people. So I find it quite interesting, and I find it quite interesting the idea of the god crying, you know, after the sort of all the violence in the sacred space. And I think it says a lot if we want to kind of look or do any kind of investigation or research to the sort of states into which mediums get. It is a very interesting story to kind of feed into that. Okay, so this was the first beat on kind of pagan stuff, etc. We're now going to talk about very briefly about exorcism in the Catholic Church. And the main reason for this is, of course, this is the main way in which embodiment has survived in our world, in our Western world, especially throughout the Middle Ages. There have been occult practices that included spirit possession, and especially after the 19th century, channeling became a huge thing with spiritualists. But up until then, the mainstream religious way of living this through the West was much more sinister, and it had to do directly with the idea of being possessed by demons. So a demonic possession here is rather different, because there's first of all usually no consensual sort of work towards manifesting the spirit. And the second reason why it is so fundamentally different is because, of course, the feeling is not nice. It is not a cleansing, wonderful, divine light feeling, but a rather sinister one. So the process is rather similar. People have dissociative states, and these dissociative states are usually marked by very strong semiotic markers. So let's say people tend to react negatively to religious objects, and this is a very strong semiotic marker. Um, People do change their voices, all of that. I have made, it is available, it is also available on Blackboard, I believe. I've made a YouTube video list of videos that are good for this class. I'm not going to show the exorcism ones. But if you're interested, you know, you have the 3 videos we've watched, you have here some exorcism videos that are rather interesting, but I think they could be too violent to just kind of show. And then you have here, the last one is another example of a Kagura dance that is still sort of ritualistic. It is still much more religious because it's done in the context of a religious ritual. Yes. But basically, you know, there's a number of semiotic signals signifying that there's a presence of a demon. These are usually heavily negative, heavily shocking, and they usually go against, of course, the mainstream um, religious and ethical beliefs of the person possessed. And this excerpt that we're going to look at now is an excerpt. It's again an excerpt of, it's a primary source. We'll be looking mostly at primary sources. And it's an exorcist thinking reflexively about his practice as an exorcist. So this is so this is from a book by Jose Antonio Fortea, which is Spanish. I think he lives in Madrid. It's a Spanish exorcist. He's one of the most well-known exorcists of the last decades, probably only second to Gabriel Amorth, but Gabriel Amorth died. So I would even risk to say that Fortea may be the most well-known Catholic exorcist alive. He has pursued an academic career in demonology. So he studied theology, but his focus is studies on demonology. And he has been an exorcist for many years. He has been involved in one of the most famous exorcisms of the last decades, really, the exorcism of Marta in Spain, which is an exorcism. I don't know if it is over now, but it's an exorcism that took almost a decade to kind of solve. Um, and there are videos of Marta's exorcism on that list. If you're interested, they're rather interesting, really. Um, and so he's a very good person to kind of bring together the sort of practitioner plus academic understanding of the phenomenon, although of course theology always looks at this from the religious point of view. So he has a very strong fundamental belief about what's happening, and is not kind of being ecumenical about it, but it's still extremely interesting as a primary source. So this book is called An Interview with an Exorcist. It's in English, which is good. Not all of his books are. So it's called Interview with an Exorcist, an insider's look at the devil, demonic possession, and the path to deliverance. And it's published by Ascension Press. And so the questions are numbered, and I took these questions from the 5th chapter. And he has a very strong grasp of demonology, studies about hell, so all of the darker sides of Catholicism, which interested me very much when I was interested in Catholicism when I was a Catholic, and so I do know his work somewhat. And so this is an interview. So the questions are the questions the interviewer has posed. And what the interviewer asks here is, why does holy water disturb demons? And the answer by Padre Fortea is, the real question is, how can something material have an influence on something spiritual? It would seem that these two realms are so distinct, so independent, that something material should not have any effect on a demon, much less expel him. Actually, though, a material object, holy water, holy chrism, etc., can torment or expel demons because the Church has given a spiritual power to this object by blessing it. In other words, the Church, with the power she has received from Christ, can join a spiritual effect to an object. Of course, the object itself has no power. Rather, the power lies in that of Christ himself, which has been placed upon the particular object. In any event, in my experience, there are materials that have a concrete effect because of what they symbolize. Here is an anecdote that touches on this fact. One winter day, extremely cold weather had frozen the pipes in my parish, and we had no water. A possessed girl I was exorcising could not be given water from the holy water font because it was several days old and many people had dipped their fingers in it. As I was preparing to go out in search of water, I remembered that there was a bottle of lemonade that had been left over from a meeting of catechists. It occurred to me to bless the contents of the bottle, thinking that the type of liquid was of little importance since its power was rooted in the prayer attached to it. I discovered, though, that its effects on the demon was much less than normal. After a few minutes, I ordered the demon in the name of Jesus to tell me why this was so. He resisted, but in the end he told me that while any blessed liquid might have some effect on the demons, holy water is more effective because it symbolizes purity and cleanliness. In fact, every material the Church blesses or consecrates, water, wine, bread, salt, incense, oil, etc., as a deep and powerful symbolism. Now, I find this one of the most interesting passages by a Catholic priest I've come across. And I find it very interesting because Fortea here is dealing with an impossible problem, which is a problem between what is the doctrine that he has accepted as his spiritual doctrine and what is his kind of direct, immediate experience of his work as an exorcism. Because um, throughout these sort of paragraphs, Fortea does border on heresy a couple of times, and so he starts very well. And he starts very well by saying, of course, the object has no power. It is a prayer of the Church that concedes power to the object. This has been, because Christianity is generally against any form of idolatry. And idolatry is the idea that you treat idols, so objects, as gods. Um, so, um, and this puts Catholics in a very difficult place because, of course, there's a number of practices that are borderline idolatrous. And of course, there's a lot of very good theological answers to these, mainly the idea, for example, that saints, a statue of a saint is not a saint himself, but it does receive the power of the saint, who receives the power from God himself. And so ultimately, when you pray to a statue of a saint, you're not praying to the statue, but to the idea that the statue reminds you of. And this idea ultimately receives his or her power from God. And therefore you're actually praying to God. And this is actually very similar to a lot of pagan ideas regarding idols, which can make the point very uncomfortable. But of course, as we've seen with Proclus does not believe that the statues themselves are gods. He believes that the statues themselves receive power from the gods who are possessing the statues. So it's a very similar position, actually. But it is a generally accepted position both in Orthodox Christianity and Catholic Christianity as a non-idolatrous position. The problem starts when he brings in the lemonade anecdote, because of course, if the power of the object comes purely from the spiritual power given to it by the Church, then why does lemonade not work? And he tries to come up with an answer, which is it has actually to do with what the object symbolizes. I mean, it doesn't come up with an answer. It's actually the demon who tells him this. It has to do with what the object himself symbolizes. But of course, here you are stepping further into the realms of heresy, because then, if there's an intrinsic symbology to an object like water and purity, and some of the power is derived from that intrinsic symbology, then you are on idolatry realm, on the realms of idolatry very strongly. And so there's a very interesting question that kind of arises from this, which is, what should Father Fortea do? Should he follow his experience? Should he reject his experience based on his own doctrine? And above all, should he trust what the demon told him? Because it is quite interesting that he goes into the realm of idolatry once he trusts the answer the demon gave him. But actually, the answer the demon is giving him goes against the teachings of the church. So it is a quite interesting passage. But above all, there's just this attempt, and this is why it's so interesting for a class on embodiment, because you start with this thing about the realm of spirit and the realm of matter are completely separated, and the object has no power, and the only power in the object comes from the spiritual power of the church and the prayer and so on and so forth. But then, very fast it becomes very promiscuous. Now there are symbolic traits that kind of spill into the material existence of the object and have a spiritual effect on a spirit that is now materialized in a specific person that is possessed. And it shows how religions do have a very hard time maintaining a very stark sort of dualism when embodiment is present, because it's very hard to make it starts to be very hard to make powerful distinctions when symbols influence material properties and material properties influence spiritual properties and so on and so forth. So I find it a very interesting passage. Then there's this question about what's demonic possession, but of course, so what he says is demonic possession is the phenomenon in which a demon resides in a body of a human being. At specific moments, the demon can speak and move through the body without the person being able to prevent it. Only the body is susceptible to demonic possession. A demon does not reside in or in any way possess the soul of the person. In all circumstances, the soul continues to be free and incapable of being possessed. Now, this is, again, a very interesting quote for different reasons. We can see here very different ethos from the texts we've been working on. So the first very different thing is, of course, the idea that the demon is actually residing in the body. So the demon lives there, whilst the other things we've seen may have the idea of temporary trance, very temporary trance, but the spirit does not inhabit the body. And above all, there's that other idea where a piece of divinity is put inside yourself for you to kind of explore and cultivate and so on and so forth. This is not the idea here. This is a completely different take on it. Here, the demon is living inside of you. And this idea that only the body is susceptible to demonic possession, and the demon does not possess the soul of the individual, is also an interesting one, because there's no strict indication that those other spirits do possess either the body or soul. Individuals are referred to as wholes. There's no differentiation, but it could be because of the specific interests of the writers. But there's certainly this idea in all of them that the inner person, the insides of the person being possessed, are filled with divine light. And the interesting thing here is that the insides of the person being possessed are not filled with demonic darkness. That's not a thing. Only the body is affected. The soul may remain as pure as it ever was. There's no dialogue between the demonic presence within the person and the soul of the person, whilst in all the other texts we've seen, there's a very clear idea that there's an ongoing dialogue between soul and divine going on there. I think this has to do fundamentally, of course, with the differences in theology, since in Christianity, divine possession is there aren't many mainstream instances of Christianity where divine possession is a thing, even, or a good thing at all. So there's the possibility to have this, but of course in other traditions, if you look upon it with good eyes, one has to wonder, if it's only affecting the body, then why would you be why would you be doing it at all? Maybe to communicate with other people, but there would be no spiritual discipline or no spiritual purpose in it. So I do think that these differences are fundamental. And yes, so you can read does the demon also possess the soul of the possessed? So he does go on the idea that the person is not responsible, morally speaking, for what he says or does during the periods of fury, when he loses consciousness and the second personality emerges. And then there's this bit about how to know if someone is possessed by a demon. And it's really interesting, because here it's all about trying to induce the trance where the semiotic aspects are going to happen. And he says that the demon is very cunning. The demon is going to try not to manifest. So you have to pray, and you have to keep praying and pray over him and all of this. And after a while, the person will start showing the semiotic aspects we've been discussing. So hands are going to twitch, the face is going to gradually tense up, he will close his eyes. If the priest lifts up his eyelids, you will see that the person's eyes are rolled back. If the prayer continues, the possessed may begin to scream or speak with an evil voice. In other cases, he lets out an evil laugh or begins to snort. And so on and so forth. But this is just to give an idea that even here, in such different circumstances, we have a very clear idea that there are semiotic aspects by which the demon manifests itself strongly. Okay, so now to enter into our kind of last beat of the session. I would like to talk about very shortly about the work of a very specific psychoanalyst who has been interested in the idea of embodied imagination. It's a concept he has created. It has to do with spirit possession mostly. So with the adaptation of spirit possession practices to dream work techniques, and it is most interesting. And I would tell you all to read him. His name is Robert Bosnak. He was a student of James Hillman, and he has worked extensively with dream work and mainly with techniques to kind of embody or be possessed by figures within dreams while also maintaining your consciousness. So he's not interested in the sort of unconscious states that people can get into, but he's rather interested in the semi-conscious ways in which people can be manifesting these things. So let's just have a look at that, which is very interesting, and then we'll be done for the day. Okay, so this is taken from the chapter 2 of embodiment. I think it's a 2007 book. I'm actually not sure at the moment, but I believe it's either 2007 or 2009. And it's embodiment by Robert Bosnak. So it's called Embodiment, Creative Imagination in Medicine, Art, and Travel. And his idea is, so very much like Hillman, was very preoccupied with the idea of staying with the image, allowing the image to kind of manifest itself without interpretation, listening to the image. Bosnak has the same sort of interest, but he's also very interested in the idea of embodying the image. And he takes this somewhat from Gestalt practices, where there's a component of drama, or of techniques where the person tries to either enact or talk as if it was a different element in the dream. But he takes it further, and he tries to make it a very embodied practices, and to create triggers within your own body by which you can come into this altered state of consciousness that is given to you in the dream. So it is a sort of radical and slightly more spiritual version of Gestalt therapy, really. But we'll be able to look at this. So just to give you some context, Bosnak is very much a storyteller, and so this is an academic book, and it is published by an academic publisher. But he does narrate his work as if he was telling a story. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. Just trying to, because I don't remember which is the editor, and I wanted to tell you just in case. Wait. It's Routledge, of course. So this is edited by Routledge. This is chapter 2, and he's talking about a woman in a dream retreat he made who had a dream about a bull, and they were doing this retreat near a cave with cave art, and so there was this kind of cave art tone to the whole thing, and cave art theme, and so he's talking about a moment where there was this dream, there was a bull charging at Berthie, and Berthie's trying to kind of switch her consciousness to that of the bull, and that's where this chapter starts. And Bosnak tells us that the closer Berthie gets to the bull, the more her body becomes infused with its power. Like walking into a storm, the bull becomes a maelstrom of turbulence. The closer we get to an image presence, the more it becomes an environment in which we find ourselves. We are pulled into the presence and participate in its medium. This is the literal meaning of the word ecstasis, a movement outside of ourselves, changing our state of being. Through this movement outside of ourselves, we are initiated into a world that is unfamiliar. Like the Sangoma, we become absorbed by embodied presences. In embodied imagination, there is an inversion of the notions of inside and outside. In Western culture, we assume that we have an inner life, which is taking place inside of us, in the same way that synaptic processes happen inside the brain. This feels obvious. But as Berthie gets closer to the bull, she is pulled into his world. From our central paradigm in this book, Dreaming Perception, the bull is not inside Berthie, but she has been absorbed into his world. In relation to Berthie, the bull is not inside, in an interior space. As the bull takes possession, it changes the very nature of the space in which Berthie finds herself. What she experiences as her inner life is actually a participation in the presence of the bull. This confusing fact has been best expressed by Henry Corbin in an article which is foundational to the study of embodied imagination. Corbin says, the relationship of interiority expressed by the proposition inside of, is inverted. Spiritual bodies or entities are not in any world, nor in their world, in the same manner as a material body is in its place or may be contained in another body. On the contrary, their world is in them. Its spiritual entity is the entire sphere of its heaven. So of course, then he goes on to say that he's not a metaphysician. So what is basic idea around this is, and um, and then of course we get into the interesting stuff, which is when the image takes possession of the person, when the substantive image takes possession, when we have come under its spell, charging bull has become embodied. Our body becomes part of the bull world, like the Zulu Sangoma's body possessed by spirits of the dead. Such an embodiment of substantive imagination is, however, not the expression of a part of our subjectivity. The bull embodies Berthe. She has passed through a state change, an ecstasis. An embodied image comes to life by possessing us. Upon being absorbed in its medium, we become the medium of its epiphany. As in truly mixed media, Berthe's subjective body is the locus for Charging Bull's self-manifestation, the veil of his appearance. Yet, of course, her specific body will affect the manifestation of Charging Bull, and so an embodied image is the interface between self and other. For an instant, like the Sangoma, Berthe and the bull have a body in common. When fully confronted with embodied imagination, both self and other turn inside out, and we become a mutual body, a mutual state. Okay, so what is interesting about all of this, and you should read the whole book, but of course I cannot show you the whole book in this context, but you should really get it and read it. What's interesting about this is the way in which Bosnak finds a phenomenological way, academic way, to look at processes of possession and use them in a psychologically fruitious manner for himself and his clients. And the basic idea here, the idea of embodied imagination, is an attempt to kind of subvert a process that has been happening in psychology ever since Freud, which is what Hillman called the process of intrapsychologization, which is this idea that suddenly everything is forcibly brought into our inside. Everything is a part of our psyche. Everything is about ourselves. Everything is about, the world is a projection of our inner being. Uh, our inner beings make the world we live in, and this changes the locus of the world very drastically, very radically into our insights. This has happened, of course, also with mediums, with actually the first case of multiple personality disorder was the result of the study of a spiritualist medium. And of course, there's a process which is scientific as well as ideological, as well as mythological, where things that are regarded as outer suddenly become inner. And so God is the archetype of the self, and the gods are manifested through our compulsions, and so they are inner versions of ourselves. And my lover is a projection of my inner struggles, and so on and so forth. um, and this sort of movement cannot really be separated from what really was the main ethos when Freud was writing the interpretation of dreams, but also when all this work was starting to kind of brew in our society, which is a very colonialist impulse of making the other ours. There's no longer an India, it is now part of the British Empire. There's no longer a Brazil, it's a part of the Portuguese Empire, and so on and so forth. And so there's a sort of colonialist ethos going on with this idea that everything that is outer must now be inner, must now be tamed. And this colonialist impulse, is present as well in Freud, in other ideas, like the idea where id is, ego shall be. So this light of consciousness, this light of rationality, shedding brilliance everywhere, everywhere that is slightly darker or that is slightly more secret. And I think that Bosnak does try, just like Hillman, actually. Bosnak makes a very serious attempt of not falling into this trap. So the idea is not to believe that everything is outside ourselves, but the idea is certainly not to bring everything into ourselves. There's a need for a dialogue or a relationship with the world around us, with the psychic forces around us, and so on and so forth. Jung does some steps in this direction, although most of his work is always interpreted in a rather intra-psychic way. But Jung does give some steps in this direction with the idea of the objective psyche that he presents. And the objective psyche, which is, for example, the universal unconscious, um, is actually all those parts of our psyche that are part of us but are not part of our inner life, are a sort of objective part of everyone's inner lives. And transpersonal psychology, which looks at, transpersonal things that exceed the person, has also kind of given steps in this direction, although many of the end results have been intrapsychological. And Hillman makes an effort in his direction by recovering the old, according to him, the old Platonic idea that the soul is not inside the body, but that the body is inside the soul. And so the soul is not in us, but we are in soul. The soul is not inner as much as it is inner and outer at the same time. And so Hillman does explore these quite radically, for example, in his work with dreams, where he says, for example, that you cannot see a fox in your dream and say that this fox is your propensity to cunning. You can say that this fox comes because of your propensity to cunning, but you cannot say it is the propensity itself. The fox is an image, and the image is independent from yourself. And above all, the image presents as independent of yourself, and this is very important, but it is also not absolutely independent of yourself. So Hillman does deal with this very much in the realm of paradox. And Bosnak then explores the same ideas, but uses the idea of embodied imagination. So fundamentally, the idea that an image, unlike us who are located in a space, an image is in itself its own space. So an image is in itself its own world. And by embodying an image, we are not bringing the bull inside of us. In this case, we are entering the world of the bull. We are entering the world of this image. We are not possessed as much because the image is residing within us, like the demon in the Catholic Church. We are possessed by the image because we're now entering the psychic space of the image. And the psychic space transforms those who live inside of it, which is a very radical statement that comes, of course, from Corbin, which is a metaphysician and presents these in the realm of the Sufi theology of imagination. But he then tries to strip this, of course, slightly of its metaphysical implications and present it as a phenomenological theory, which is very interesting. Yes, so the most important thing about this, of course, and this is why he uses that's why he uses the etymology of the word ecstasy so much, is this idea that ecstasy is a step outside of yourself. And this is fundamental for the change in consciousness. You're not going further inside yourself. Ecstasy requires this mutual agreement between something that is inside and something that is outside. And it is this blurring of the boundaries, and it is this relationship that is explored through the radical blurring of boundaries that allows for the ecstatic moment to be achieved and for Bethy to become bull. And of course, it is in this radical process of consciousness change, even if momentary, that resides the power and that resides the potential for the strongest epiphanies. Of course, is quite obviously relating this to the Sangoma, which in this case, so the Sangoma are Zulu shamans and Zulu priests who are who make use of spirit possession as well. So there's a clear use of the tradition of spirit possession in a more psychological way, but that refuses intrapsychologization as a strategy to deal with these matters. I think if you are, interested by this idea of spirit possession or spirit embodiment, or anything like that, I would very seriously suggest that you read this book by Robert Bosnak. Actually, read everything by Robert Bosnak, is not much, and because I think that he gives the most interesting academic, phenomenological, self-reflexive reading possible of practices of divine possession and embodiment that we have available. So this was basically it. You have, on Blackboard, you have more text. You have a text on the Kagura dance, if you want to have an idea of the historical roots of Kagura, and if you want to have an idea of the schools that still practice it, different genres, stuff like that, you can use it. You have the YouTube, video list, and you have two interesting videos of demonic possession there. One with Padre Antonio Forte, and another with Gabriele Amor, which are two high-profile actual Catholic exorcists. So they're not sort of cheating videos or openly cheating videos. These are the guys that the Catholic Church stands by. And you have all the handouts I've presented. You have the full reference for Bosnak's book, and you have plenty of things to explore. And yes, so do have fun. Ask for, of course, tutor support if you want to answer a question related to this. And I guess that's it. Bye bye. Thank you for coming.